So Hellboy got a new movie, and it kind of came out of nowhere for me. I think I knew this was happening to some degree because somebody had released a trailer link and talked about how low budget it had looked maybe a few months ago, but I don't honestly think I knew another Hellboy was happening otherwise. And this comes after the box office failure and critical failure that was the David Harbour Hellboy. And of course, everyone remembers the Ron Perlman, Guillermo del Toro films. And so Hellboy is a pretty recognizable franchise at this point. And so this was one that, because of the other films, which I've seen each one of them once, I'm not a big Hellboy fanatic by any means, and I've definitely never read a single Hellboy comic. And so I went into this one with zero expectations, knowing that this had a much smaller budget than the others. And I looked into it, and this is being written by the guy who wrote the comics, alongside of a couple other screenplay writers as well. And from what I could tell from the trivia on this, this was the first one that he really actually worked on in the script department. So that made me think well, at least it'll probably be faithful, if nothing else. And the director of this is the guy who did the Crank movies, which I'm a big fan of and I think are absolutely chaotic and fun as hell. And if you haven't seen them, they're just wild movies. So that gave me some hope for this for sure. Now, this time around, the movie goes way more into the horror realm with a $20 million budget. And, having not known really anything about it and knowing very little about the comics, I did look into this very specific comic that this is being adapted from, which is The Crooked Man, right? Hellboy the Crooked Man. I looked at that comic and I looked at a lot of pages of it, and I will tell you, this is pretty much, from what I've seen of the comic, which I looked at quite a few pages, this looks like a shot-for-shot reenactment of that comic. So if you are a big fan of the Hellboy comics and you feel like the films thus far, up until this point, were not faithful, this seems to be extremely faithful. So take that for what it's worth. And being the horror fan, and that's why I'm covering it on the channel, that I am, I very much appreciate this going much more into the horror territory, and it very much did. And for that, I greatly enjoyed this. I had a good time with this. This currently has a really negative rating on IMDb, and I think that's mostly due to the budget. And the thing that upsets me about that is that we get fan films every year that come out, whether it's a Friday the 13th fan film or whatever. People will just give glowing reviews to those all day and be like, why can't studios make them more like this? And this is better than half the films in the franchise and this and that. And I think they're overblowing those. I don't think they almost ever stack up against the studio-made films. So I feel like if this was a fan-made film, people would be like, oh my God, why the studios really need to take a note from this book and do something more like this, because this is amazing for what it is, and blah, blah, blah. So I do kind of find that ironic that because this is technically studio made, that they won't look past that and really just kind of knock it for budgetary restraints. But for me, I actually like the smaller scale of this. Because it is more horror and because it is more character centric, and that we're not doing anything huge, we are doing a much smaller scale story. I actually found myself invested more in the story because it's not just so grandiose like in the other movies that I had watched that actually made me fairly disconnected, because the Ron Perlman ones, he's cracking a lot of one-liners and jokes. Same thing kind of with the David Harbour movie, even though that's a little more R-rated, and the Guillermo del Toro movies are in the PG-13 realm. This is very much R, and I really enjoyed the way that the horror was done here. Yes, it does feel like the budget limits it to some degree, but as far as the depiction of Hellboy, I actually really like this Hellboy. I think that he's grittier. And the look of him, even though it is similar-ish to the other ones, it looks more comic accurate. But once again, I'm not some expert on the comics, but when I do look into the reviews, the people who are praising this film are the fans of the comics. They are the ones that are like, this is an actual adaptation of the comics for once, and therefore, I like this one much more for that reason. This actually, it reminded me a bit story-wise of and kind of like tone with the characters and how they're dealing with the situation. It actually kind of reminded me of The Dark Tower, where Hellboy is Roland, and then you can insert other comics and whatever, or characters, sorry, within this to liken to the other characters within the Dark Tower. But that's actually kind of what it was giving me vibes of, and of course, as a Dark Tower fan, I was like, oh, okay, this is cool. And there's some really cool horror shots in here. There's something with skin on a bed. If you've read the comic, you'll know what it is. I thought that was really cool. The Crooked Man himself, the titular villain here, I liked him. He looks exactly like the comic book character that we see here. The depictions of the sets, like the church that they go to and whatever, it's straight out of the comic. It looks exactly the same. The shovel that he uses, everything. I mean, as I said, it just looks shot for shot. And character development here, and like their goal was a little muddied for me. And this is something that maybe would do better on the second watch, because I didn't know what to make of this film at first, and I was really mostly focusing on the action and like the CG, and which there's little of both, both action and CG. There is some, and it's not great, and then as far as the action goes, that's also very, very limited. It is a smaller budgeted thing, so it's a lot of talking. And a lot of character interaction with one another. So, I don't know. I think that people who are like massive fans of the comics, this is going to be a cult classic to them. This is going to be something that they're going to be like, yes, finally a Hellboy adaptation that actually feels like Hellboy. And it isn't some like big, large-scale Marvel type of comic book adaptation, which is what Hellboy isn't, from what I've seen from other people who are Hellboy comic fans and are saying this very thing. I do think that that's going to be kind of the general consensus. People who are familiarized with the Ron Perlman and the David Harbour movies that are looking for that bigger Marvel type budgeted film with a lot of like crazy action and a lot of like, ADHD, comic book action sequences, that is not here at all. If you want a smaller scale, more stripped down, comic accurate version of this, then I think this is one that you're gonna dig. But I think anyone who's looking for the former, yeah, they're gonna be like, this is trash. The budget is really low here, and this feels like a fan made film. But once again, the irony would be if it actually was a fan made film, they'd probably be blowing it. So I don't know. I dug this. I'm glad I watched it. I didn't know what to expect at all, and was pleasantly surprised. So will this get the attention and I shouldn't say praise, but good reviews that it deserves? I think eventually. But for right now, it's going to be one of those movies that people shit on out the gate, right? Like, it's going to be a lot of negativity towards it at first, and then over time people will grow on this movie, and you'll have a small minority that is very loud about how much they love this and how much they'd like a sequel and whatever. I doubt a sequel will ever happen, and what new iteration of Hellboy we'll get in the future remains to be seen. But I don't know. If you are a big fan of the comics, don't sleep on this one. If you're hesitant on the $20 price tag that it currently has, that I completely understand. It is also in theaters, I think limited, so you'd have to really look for it. But yeah, if you're wanting to wait for the price to come down, that makes perfect sense. But for now, that's my thoughts on it. Yeah, it's cool. that's how I thought about it. So what'd you guys think about it? Let me know. I'll see you in the comments. Adios.